All right, guys, what's up? When it comes to like the most dominant centers of all time, there are usually two candidates that pop up. That's Wilt Chamberlain and Shaquille O'Neal. And I think people who are my age, maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger, a lot of people tend to look at Shaquille O'Neal. And he was, in my opinion, the most dominant player of his generation. I mean, he came in the NBA in '92, 7'1", 301 pounds. This is when he was slimmer. This is when he was compared to David Robinson. People started calling him like a bigger version of David Robinson. This was when Shaq was a lot leaner, a little bit more springier as far as his athleticism is concerned. Grabbed 18 rebounds his rookie debut. He was really raw his rookie year. I think he averaged something like 20. What did he average his rookie year? I think 23 points, like 11 rebounds or something like that. 11 or 12 rebounds. Shot 56% from the floor. Easily won the Rookie of the Year award. His only competition was Alonzo Mourning as far as in that draft is concerned. And Alonzo Mourning did have in my opinion, a borderline Hall of Fame career, especially when you consider his Georgetown years. But Shaq was really raw at the beginning. His main Achilles heel at that time was that his free throw shooting was subpar, which actually got worse over time. And he didn't have much of a post game for the first couple of years. He got a lot of his baskets off of dunks and just sheer raw power and size. But over time, Shaq did develop certain signature moves, in my opinion. He developed a jump hook. I remember that. He also had a move called the Black Tornado, which was a spin move. And he also had another move that he had, another go-to move that he had, which was a drop step move. So he did have 3 or 4 basic moves. He was never Akeem Olajuwon, but he improved. He also improved as a passer, in my opinion, as he got older. But one thing that happened too as he got older is that he gained more weight. During his Lakers career, I say around 2000, from about 2000 to about 2003 or so, Shaq was listed as 340, but he played around 360, 370, and he was huge. And while this added to his strength, because Shaq was tired of getting banged around by guys throughout his career, so he had to get bigger and stronger to endure that. It hurts him as far as his lateral movement is concerned and his mobility. Because of the added weight, in my opinion, Shaq endurance suffered. I think he only had one season where he averaged 40 minutes per game. I remember there were many stretches when he was at his heaviest that Shaq rested on defense. There were certain games where he was amped up blocking shots, but he was not as effective defensively when he got heavier, in my opinion, as he was when he was younger in his Orlando Magic days. But Shaq, when he was with the Lakers, shook off that reputation he had as a loser, because in the postseason his teams were not successful, and oftentimes they were swept. Not saying that it was just Shaq himself that got swept, but a lot of times during the postseason when he was with Orlando Magic and earlier in his Lakers years, his teams got swept in embarrassing fashion oftentimes. Swept by teams such as the Pacers, the Houston Rockets come to mind, the Chicago Bulls, Championship Bulls, '96, and the Utah Jazz. So, but in 2000, Shaq won his first title, the first of 3 consecutive. And Shaq and Kobe looked like they were going to be the most dominant duo of all time at one point in time, like they were on their way to at least 6 titles in the 2000s, maybe more. But friction between the two, as far as who's going to be the most dominant and all that, who was going to be the alpha male, so to speak. Kobe was often disgusted at the fact that he thought that Shaq was lazy. Shaq just thought because of the fact that he was older and because of his personality, he was the general, he should run things. And ultimately, the Lakers chose to side with Kobe. Saying that he was younger, he had the more upside. Ultimately, that was the right decision because at that particular time in 2004, Shaq was 32 years old and was on the downside of his career. Now, Shaq would win another title with the Miami Heat, but slowly he began to regress as a basketball player. But because of his size, though, and skill, he did have skill. And I don't like when people say that he was just a big dude that just scored everybody, because the same thing you said about Wilt Chamberlain. I'm saying there's a lot of big players in the NBA who can't score a lick. But he became something of a journeyman toward the end of his career, playing with the Miami Heat, then the Phoenix Suns, the Cleveland Cavaliers, and finally with the Boston Celtics. But Shaq truly is one of the great players, and I think he's a top 10 all-time, or close to top 10 all-time player, depending on how you judge players. I include the ABA as well, so when I include that, that pushes Julius Erving into the top 10 and pushes Shaq to like number 11 on my list. So he's just outside the top 10 in my opinion. But he's a truly tremendously great player who could have been better had he had more dedication as far as conditioning and improving his overall game. One thing I'll say about his free throw shooting is when you have hands as large as him, it's often hard to be a great foul shooter. That's just how it is. You don't have much of a touch and feel for the basketball. I myself have very large hands, not as large as Shaq's, but I have large hands. And whenever I would shoot foul shots, it was really hard for me to have the same touch and feel for the basketball as a guy who has the hand size of, let's say, a Stephen Curry or a Reggie Miller or a Jeff Hornacek or Steve Kerr. But segueing to Wilt Chamberlain, the differences between the two, they're both were dominant. But Wilt had more of a finesse game, or more of I would say it was a little bit more finesse earlier on in his career, especially with the Philadelphia Warriors. He transitioned to more of a power game once he passed 30 years of age. I think that Wilt realized, I'll tell you this, Wilt was a little bit, I'm not going to say Wilt was a selfish player, but Wilt realized something. Earlier on in his career, Wilt was his first year in the league, he averaged 37.6 points per game. His second year, 38.4 points per game. His third year, 50.4 points per game. Of course, the highest scoring average for any player in NBA history. His next year, 44.8 points per game, 36.9, 34.7, and his last scoring title, 33.5 points per game, remember serving me correctly. The 7 consecutive scoring titles. As you can tell, the last few years, his scoring was beginning to drop. This was because the first couple of years, Alex Hannum, I think who was the coach at the time, theorized that if Wilt was to shoot the basketball, because the teams just couldn't compare it to the Boston Celtics, the overall talent of the Philadelphia Warriors. So what happened is that he theorized that the first couple of years, if my team constantly loses to the Boston Celtics by 9 or 10 points, and Wilt's averaging 37, 38, if he averages 50, maybe we can beat him. And it didn't actually occur. So ultimately, when he went from the Philadelphia Warriors, which became the San Francisco Warriors, and then ultimately he was traded to the Sixers, Wilt became playing more of a team game. And but as he got fewer and fewer shots, he figured out that, well, for me to maximize this, I have to make more of my field goals. So he slowly transitioned to becoming more of a post player. Early in his career, Wilt had a nice fadeaway jumper, up to about 17, 18 feet out. As he got older, he stopped shooting from outside and scored almost totally within the, in the post, and he stopped shooting that jumper. Early in his career, Wilt was a 46%, 48%, and 50% shooter. Whereas with his later years with the Sixers and the Lakers, Wilt shot somewhere around 63 to 73% from the field. A truly exceptionally accurate player. And I'm trying to make other comparisons. Wilt was a smaller person overall as far as his body frame. Shaq played from 301 pounds to 370 pounds during his NBA career. Chamberlain played between 258 to 320 pounds per game in his NBA career. The difference is that Shaq always had a higher level of body fat percentage than Wilt. Wilt really didn't show any body fat percentage at all until he played with the Lakers. I remember talking to someone, or communicating with someone on YouTube, and they said that, well, Wilt was flabby when he played with the Lakers. And I'm like, are you serious? Flabby? I don't know what some people are looking at. That might have been Wilt with maybe 10% body fat. So maybe a comparison to when he had 4% body fat. Yeah, he looked flabby then, but the difference though is Wilt was one of the strongest men literally to ever live, one of the strongest athletes ever. And he's pretty much without question the strongest basketball player of all time. Shaq in his prime could bench press about 450. Might remember a couple years ago there was a mock weightlifting contest between Barkley and Shaq. And Shaq, at that time, did legitimately bench press about 400 pounds. But this is when, he kind of struggled to do it. This is when Shaq was retired. He's probably about 380 or so pounds. Chamberlain, when he was younger, was able to easily bench press 400 pounds. And ultimately, he got his bench press up. I remember reading when Wilt Chamberlain was young, when he was the wiry Wilt, he was able to arm wrestle and beat everybody, with the sole exception of Jim Brown. Jim Brown beat Wilt Chamberlain in an arm wrestling contest. And Wilt Chamberlain, being as competitive as he was, with the machismo attitude that he had, began to dedicate himself more to weightlifting. And ultimately, Jim Brown could no longer beat Wilt Chamberlain in arm wrestling. And Wilt Chamberlain was able, most documentation say that he was able to bench press up to 500 pounds. But there was a weightlifter friend of Wilt's. I can't remember his name. I have to research a little bit more to remember his name. But he was 6'2", 250 pounds. And he said that, and he himself was able to bench press 500 pounds. And he said that he saw Wilt do this. He said that Wilt had actually got his bench press up to at least near 600 pounds. And that he was well able to bench press over 500 pounds. When Wilt was 59 years old, he was still able to bench press 465 pounds. And at that particular stage of his career, Wilt Chamberlain already had a heart disease. So that's very, very impressive. There's a lot of things that I could just say about Wilt Chamberlain as far as his strength is concerned. Some people say it's exaggerated, which is ridiculous. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger, of all people, could document this and verify this. And you can see it on YouTube. There's a video footage of Red Buttons, a comedian, being lifted up like a baby by Wilt Chamberlain during some type of roast, or some type of, I think it was a comedy roast. And those old Dean Martin comedy roasts, it's a clip. And he lifts Red Buttons and extends him out with his hands with no effort. Now, of course, Red Buttons wasn't a large man. He was only 5'6", 140 pounds. But to do that to another human being requires a lot of strength, exceptional strength to do that. There was a game back in the 60s where Gus Johnson, one of the most underrated players in NBA history, comparative in size, he was like Charles Barkley, but without the extra fat on him, had dunked on Wilt Chamberlain in a game in 1967. And later on that same game, Gus Johnson tried to dunk on Wilt Chamberlain again, Wilt Chamberlain cleanly blocked his shot. He didn't foul him. He blocked his shot. But this time, Wilt Chamberlain didn't hold back on his strength. And for the first and only time in NBA history, an NBA player had his shoulder dislocated from being blocked. That tells you the strength of Wilt Chamberlain. There was another instance where Wilt Chamberlain had dunked the basketball so hard that when the ball came through the net, the ball hit the foot of Johnny Red Kerr, who was a center at the time. And, of course, it's the same Johnny Red Kerr that years later became an announcer, long-time announcer with the Chicago Bulls. I believe he died the same day as Norm Van Leer, the Chicago Bulls legend from the 70s, back in February 2009, if I remember serving correctly. But Johnny Red Kerr said that the ball, when it hit his foot, broke his toe. Even Artis Gilmore, who most people say is the second strongest player in NBA history, was not able to contend with Wilt. And there was a game where in 1992, I believe it was, Robert Parrish, who played against Artis Gilmore and Shaq, when asked who was stronger, said that Shaq was more athletic, but Artis Gilmore was stronger than Shaq. So, having said all of that, and yes, I understand that Shaq broke a rim, but you got to also take this into consideration. Shaq put all of his weight down on the rim when he did that. He intentionally tried to do that. In Shaq's era, there was the breakaway rim. In Wilt's era, there was not a breakaway rim. And also, there are even some people who say that it was strategically placed in certain games to pump up the interest in the NBA, where the rim might have been tampered with a little bit to make it more susceptible for Shaq to do that, because Shaq's never been able to do that, duplicate that in an NBA game again after the rookie year, when Shaq was actually stronger than he was that rookie year. But anyway, aside from the strengths, I just think that Wilt Chamberlain was a better overall basketball player. Of course, he's arguably the greatest rebounder of all time. I think it's Dennis Rodman. But any guy with 23,924 rebounds, averaging 22.9 rebounds per game, certainly merits conversation as far as the greatest rebounders of all time. He was a better defensive player, in my opinion. Arguably the greatest shot blocker of all time. I've always estimated that if statistics were counted, Wilt would probably have 10,000 career blocks. I think he and Bill Russell would be number one, number two in that category. I think Wilt was a better passer. Of course, Wilt's the only center to lead the NBA in assists. Athlete, it's no contest. Absolutely no contest whatsoever. Shaq was a very good athlete, but Wilt Chamberlain was an Olympian caliber athlete. Olympian. Shot putter. All right. Able to run, able to run a 40-yard dash in 4.4 or 4.5, 4.6 or something like that. We're talking about a 7 foot, 260 or 70 pounds man. Just a tremendous basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain was. It's more than just the records. In so many ways, I kind of have to laugh when people say that Shaq would have been even more dominant in Wilt's era, because a lot of the moves that Shaq got away with would be considered offensive fouls in Wilt Chamberlain's era. You couldn't dip your shoulder and bull through people at that time. You had to actually. That's one of the reasons why I always say to people that centers were forced to be more skilled back then. You couldn't just bully your way through people. And defensive players had a lot more leeway back then. You know, there was a such thing as mauling. Defensive players didn't foul out of games frequently as they do. Even in Jordan's era, it was starting to be counted against centers to do certain things. No, I don't think Shaq would have been as effective. in Wilt's time. I gotta also say though that I wonder how effective Wilt will be now because of the way the game is played. It's difficult, and I say that because the way that the game is played now, with such a focus on outside shooting, I don't even know if Wilt Chamberlain would exist today. You know what I mean? Like, would he even exist? But that's an argument for another video. I think that, in conclusion, in my opinion at least, I think that Wilt Chamberlain is the most dominant center of all time, the most dominant player of all time. Shaquille O'Neal is probably the second most dominant player of all time, but the difference between the two is still quite considerable. And I don't think there's no shame in that. And also, I always got the feeling that Shaq was a little bit envious of Wilt's shadow over the league. Just recently was the 55th anniversary of the 100-point game that Wilt Chamberlain had, and Shaq insisted that a player today could still, do that, so score 100 points. And he brought up Klay Thompson's 60 points, and Charles Barkley refuted him, saying that but he was still 40 points short. And Klay Thompson had one of those nights that you only have once, maybe twice in a career. He also stated that one of his biggest regrets is that he wasn't able to pass Wilt Chamberlain scoring when he suffered a career-ending injury during the 2010-11 season with the Boston Celtics. And while Chamberlain, Shaq was, 28,000, what was it, like 2,500 points short of Wilt? At that point in his career, Shaq would have had to play, another 3 seasons maybe to pass Wilt. And even if you do pass him in scoring, I've never been as impressed with longevity records if you played in 200 or more games more than the guy you passed. You're not more dominant because the guy who you passed was more prolific because he did it in fewer games. Sort of like how there was that argument against Hank Aaron when he passed Babe Ruth. True, you passed Babe Ruth in career home runs. I'm just being fair and honest here. Yes, you passed Babe Ruth in home runs, but it took you 4,000 more bats to pass him. So Ruth is still more prolific. But you get my argument with that one. But you've heard my case at least. What do you think was the most dominant center of all time? Was it Wilt Chamberlain, Shaquille O'Neal, or maybe you have someone else in mind?